Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another beautiful day. Today, we're going to be talking about living versus non-living. This is the very beginning of our life sciences unit. And in order to truly dive into these things, you have to be able to determine what makes an organism living or non-living. So before we even look at doing the sort with in the area that we're going to look at, we need to talk about what makes an organism living. Now, if the first thing is that a living organism is going to respond to environmental stimulus. So, for example, this means that you have, let's say, grass, okay? You have grass that when exposed to too much sun dies. So if the grass gets too much sun, it dies. This could also be if there is a drought, meaning that there's not enough water, an animal will travel to a location where they can find it. They'll go in search of it. Search other environments. Okay. So for you or I as a human, if we go outside and it's pouring rain, our response to that environmental stimulus is to go back inside and get an umbrella. Let's say if you have a dog and they are barking, for my German Shepherd, for Sophie, she barks when she sees squirrels. So squirrels coming into her environment caused her to respond by barking and getting upset because the environmental stimulus, which is the squirrel coming into her domain, caused her to bark. Okay. So responding to environmental stimulus is that a living organism does something because of something in its environment. All right. So the next thing is that if an organism is living, then that means that they reproduce. They have babies, they create seeds. New life comes from them in some way, okay? So whether this is babies or seeds, etc., they reproduce somehow. The next element is that they grow. That's pretty straightforward. You and I grow every day. You as a student, as someone who is still in childhood, your bones are growing every day. Your brain is growing every day. You are developing larger blood supplies. Your muscles are growing. Everything about you is in the process of developing and growing. All right. The next is that living things will adapt and evolve. So let's take, for instance, let's say you have an animal that lives primarily on land, but their environment goes through a very long time, hundreds of years, where there's a lot more water in their environment. The animals of that species may, if they have webbing, say that at the beginning they have tiny little bits of webbing between their toes, okay? But those that the webbing is more pronounced, is bigger, are going to survive better than those who have less, which means that the animals that are then in that ecosystem that are growing, that are reproducing, are going to continue to have bigger and bigger webbings because that's what it takes to survive. So they adapt by learning to swim, and they evolve because those that survive have webbing in between the toes. And every generation, that webbing is going to get bigger and bigger to help them evolve in order to adapt better in their environment. And the last one is that it eats or makes its own food for energy. You and I eat every day. Plants use sunlight, oxygen, nutrients, and water to make their own food. So in some way, if it's living, it ingests or creates its own food in order to do all of these things, because all of us, all of our bodies, anything that's living needs energy in order to survive. All right, so there we go. We have the basis for an understand if an organism is living. Okay. We are going to look at one type of ecosystem. It's called a tide pool. Now, tide pools are usually found where land meets water, usually in rocky outcroppings that when the tide comes in, those areas fill up with water. And there are certain plants and animals that live in there. And when the tide goes out, the water recedes, but not enough where it's gone, but those animals can still survive. Okay, so we're looking at tide pools. So the first thing that we are going to look at is a piece that literally makes up the basis, the foundation of these tide pools, which is rocks. Now we need to decide, are rocks living or non-living? Well, rocks don't grow. They don't reproduce. They don't eat or make their own food. They don't adapt and evolve. They don't grow. They don't respond to environmental stimulus. So they are non-living. Pretty straightforward. Let's think about water. Water, does it respond to environmental stimulus? Scientifically, there could be an argument, because if it gets too cold, it freezes. If it gets too hot, that ice then melts. But that's a change in matter. It's not a true response to environmental stimulus. It doesn't reproduce, it doesn't adapt and evolve, it doesn't grow, and it doesn't eat or make its own food, so it's non-living. Now we have barnacles. Now barnacles are something that you will find in a tide pool. These are a type of tiny microscopic little organisms that build upon each other. They do respond to environmental stimulus. They do reproduce. They adapt and evolve. They grow, and they have to eat. Therefore, they are living. Let's take a look at, red algae. That's an interesting one, and I'm going to move my camera a little bit so that we have a little bit more room to work with here. There we go. So red algae. Well, we know that algae is a type of plant. Plants make their own food using sunlight, oxygen, nutrients, and water. They grow, they adapt and evolve, they respond to environmental stimulus, they reproduce, whether through seeds or extensions of their roots. So we know that red algae is living. Now this is an interesting one. Bacteria. Yes, bacteria lives in tide pools just like it lives on the surfaces in our lives. Bacteria is a microscopic organism that does reproduce. In order to reproduce, most bacteria actually split themselves. They start as one piece and they actually split themselves in half. So you then have a copy of the original. So they do reproduce, they adapt and evolve. In order for them to live if they cannot find what they need, they'll mutate. So they do adapt and evolve, they do grow, and they usually live off of the nutrients that they can find in the cells of other organisms. So they are living. What about, sand? What do we know about sand? Sand is created over hundreds, possibly thousands of years because rocks are weathered, eroded, and deposited into new locations, either through air beating on the rock, water beating on the rock, ice breaking the rock apart, impact of other things. And then over time, that rock that was originally big gets broken and broken and broken and broken and broken and broken through weathering. It gets taken away through erosion and then ends up on our beaches as sand. So since sand is essentially a very tiny rock that has been weathered over time, it is non-living. Salt. We all know that the ocean is salt water. And let's think about it. Salt is a mineral. It's technically a nutrient. It dissolves in water and it combines with water molecules in order to create what we call saline. Saline is the combination of salt molecules and water molecules. It does not respond to environmental stimulus. It doesn't reproduce. It doesn't adapt and evolve. It does not grow, and it does not need to eat or make its own food to have energy. So salt is non-living. Now here's an interesting thing. It's called a limpet. Limpets are these little things in these pictures. You could probably Google them to see some other images. They are a type of creature that live in tide pools. They respond to their environmental stimulus, they reproduce, they adapt and evolve, they grow, and they eat in order to have energy. So they are living. Now this is a fun one. This is one of my kind of favorites of tide pools, I'm not gonna lie, just because I think they're cool. Sea stars. Now I want you to take a guess. Do you think a sea star is living or non-living? If you said living, you are correct. Sea stars are a living organism that come in all shapes, sizes, colors, and they are really, really cool to investigate. So if you've never actually looked into the different species of sea star, you might want to Google it sometime. They're fun. Now, the next one is a hermit crab. You've seen these before. They sell them in stores. They're little crabs that literally live inside a shell. We know that they eat, they grow, they adapt and evolve, they reproduce. We know that these are living. They're really cool little creatures too. I actually had some as classroom pets one year. All right. Just try to make sure that we can get everything in the video. All right, and let's look at this one, eelgrass. Now, when you look at this picture, it doesn't actually look like an eel, but the second half of its name is grass. The reason for that is this grass floats in water that makes it look like an eel. So that's why it's called eel grass. Well, we know that grass is a plant, and plants are living. They make their own food, they grow, they reproduce, they adapt and evolve, they respond to stimulus. So eelgrass is living. And our last one is a sea anemone. That's a word that a lot of people have a problem pronouncing. A sea anemone is actually a type of creature. Clownfish like to live in them. Clownfish actually have a defense against the poisons and stingers that they let off. It doesn't bother them. They're a little bit immune. So clownfish can live in them and create that symbiotic relationship. Sea anemones are alive. They do make their own food. They grow, they adapt and evolve, they reproduce, they respond to environmental stimulus. So they are alive. So this just kind of gives you a little idea of how you can take elements of an ecosystem and break it down to determine, is it living or is it non-living? And remember, keep these with you if you're ever unsure. What makes an organism living? If you need to Google it to research, go for it. If you're not sure what something is, then hey, you've got resources at your fingertips. You are masters of Google Foo. You can research it. All right, well, thank you guys so much for joining me today. I had fun. I hope you did too, and I look forward to seeing y'all next time.